let me just say I am the new Commissioner of Public Lands. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my role because not very many states have it. Washington State is one of the few states in the nation that has a Commissioner of Public Lands. It's an elected position. My responsibility as the Commissioner of Public Lands is that I oversee about a quarter of the state of Washington. So I manage over 6 million acres of agriculture, forest, and aquatic lands. I regulate over 8 million acres of private timberlands. Think of Weyerhaeuser. We're also the state geologists, so we're at the front line of landslides, earthquakes, floods, 5 active volcanoes in Washington State. We are also the largest on-call firefighting force in the state, and if you think wildfires, that's where we are. So from our critical natural resource lands to our absolute natural disaster response that we have, we understand very, very closely the importance of making more communities more resilient. In addition to that, we also generate over $300 million a year on 3 million acres of land that supports our local governments, our schools, our hospitals, our libraries, our police and fire. We have land in every single county of the state of Washington. When you look at this map up here, everything that is pink, blue, purple, brown, yellow, every color but light green is the lands that we manage. And some of those are in very large, significant chunks. And then in addition, you'll see very tiny 6-acre, 2-acre plots that we manage. All of those generate the funds for the counties and our schools. So let's talk agriculture. We have 1.1 million acres of agriculture lands. It generates $22.6 million in revenue annually. It's from grazing and wheat to soy to crops to, thank goodness, vineyards and orchards, which are only growing in numbers. So the challenges that we face with climate change that is here and very real is we are seeing increasing summer soil deficit. In fact, we've already experienced dust storms in Washington State just last month, pretty significant. In addition to that, we are also seeing significant reduction in water supply that all of those million acres of farmlands depend on. In fact, in the last 10 years, we've seen the most significant droughts in our state has ever had. So what are we doing about it? So one of the things that we're able to do is actually go and purchase land with the goal of obviously managing it not only for the environment but for those local communities because we are the trust fiduciary for the schools and the counties. And so what we've been doing is actually investing in identifying the critical water sources in Washington State and starting to actually purchase lands that have significant water resources that are not actually being utilized wisely, as well as also identifying water resources we have on our current lands and then implementing energy water efficiency standards into it. We are also looking at new technologies that not only get at energy like the last group discussion, but also able to start to do storage of water because we're going to see more severe water storms. We are still seeing significant rain. We're just getting it in the winter and the fall and early springs, but unfortunately it leads to the significant landslides that we've had. We had 100 landslides just in eastern Washington this year in 1 month alone, and eastern is our most driest part of our state. So this is an opportunity we're looking at, actually, believe it or not, with Shell Oil that would look at an opportunity of having to store that water and then being able to put it back into the flows for Salmon River that generates energy, but also be able to store it and get it out to farmlands at the critical times when we don't have it. One good thing about climate change, because I got to look at hope and promise, is while California has been doing really well in agriculture, it's not going to look so good in the coming future. Whereas in Washington State, we're actually looking pretty good for maybe 20, 50 years at best. So we're actually going to leverage that resource of recognizing that we're going to have longer, warmer seasons than we're used to having that enables us to actually start growing crops. Our goal is that we're going to be identifying lands within communities that right now don't have a stable source of food supply because their winters are longer or they're drier, and be able to start to diversify the agricultural production there and also look at it as a context of growing local foods. The other piece I talked to you about, we have 6-acre plots, 2-acre plots. Most of those lands right now are actually just lying there in waste. They're lying there in waste because they're too small or in the wrong location to actually be used for agricultural production. So we are going to begin selling those lands. Many of them oftentimes are in our urban centers, believe it or not, and actually utilize the revenue from that to go buy larger pieces of agriculture and forest lands and begin to aggregate our own lands, but also start to use it as a way of starting to reduce the sprawl and conversion that we are finding in Washington State. We talked about climate refugee. We have about 1,000 people coming to Seattle every single week. 1,000 people just in Seattle, and it's spreading even farther into many other areas of our state, as many of them are realizing this is going to be a very good place to live for a while. For that, we need to make sure that we are protecting our working farmlands and forest lands, which we depend on to feed us. So forest resources. We manage 2.1 million acres of forest lands in Washington State. It generates over $150 million of revenue, again, for schools and counties. And here's the challenge we face. We have 2.7 million acres of forests in Washington State that are dying due to disease, drought, insects. Half of those are on federal lands. The other half are our state and our tribal lands. This is a problem that is resulting in more catastrophic wildfires. In the last 3 years alone, we've lost over 1 million acres of land to wildfires. We spent over $500 million in property damage as a result of wildfires. And when I said we are the largest wildfire fighting team in the state, this is the front line for us. And we already have seen wildfires just the last 2 months alone, and we're competing with resources with the Californias, the Oregons, the Idahos, the Colorados. This is a place where we have to get on top of the forest health. So what we've been doing is we've actually developed, this is an unhealthy forest. I was just in Eastern Washington earlier this week, or last week, and this is the kind of thing you're seeing everywhere you go. We are starting to actually develop a 20-year forest health plan that enables us to start treating 100,000 acres a year of our public forest lands by doing prescribed burning, selective thinning, active management that starts to clean up that forest. In addition, we signed, and there's probably the only good news I have with our work with the federal government right now, but just 2 months ago, we signed a historic agreement with the federal government that enables us to actually now get onto federal lands, millions of acres, and actually start to do the treatment, because many of our, like I said, 2.7 million acres, half of those are federal lands, and no treatment is being done whatsoever. They have no resources or capacity on the ground. And as you know, budget cuts are only gonna make that worse. In addition to that, we have one of the biggest nurseries in Washington State, which we actually partner with our timber industry to be able to start to actually develop new seeds that will actually be able to withstand the kinds of challenges that we're seeing with disease, insect, and drought, so that we can get ahead of this problem. I will say one of the biggest challenges of those millions of acres that we lost due to fire, we don't have the ability to plant them. Not only do we not have the ability because we don't have the funding resources because it wasn't planned and part of the budget, but in addition to that, we can't get enough seed stock actually. And we're not alone. The private timber companies are in the same place. We can't get enough seed stock to actually go out and plant those forests to actually reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and also ensure that we're holding the water in place and preventing landslides and other challenges. Aquatic resources, so 2.6 million acres of are managed by the state of Washington in my role. So all of your entire coastline of Washington State, the Puget Sound, all of your rivers, streams, and lakes, 2.6 million acres. We lease to ports like the Port of Seattle. We have about 75 ports in Washington State. We are the front line to actually stopping the exportation of coal and oil to overseas. And this is an example right here where Seattle, and people might remember the Shell terminal piece, but also we have 4 other projects that were being initiated for coal and oil that we so far right now have been able to stop due to not leasing to them. In addition to that, we have one of the largest shellfish industries. We generate about $26 million annually just in geoduck sales, and everybody knows geoducks is the craze in China. I say people know that we are in the ag production industry, the timber production industry, but I also, and I have to softly say this because my staff gets mad, we're in the sex product industry. Really, because $26 million of our lands are actually leased and growing shellfish. So landslides, we heard the conversation about sea level rise. Every single one of our aquatic lands areas, we have 2.6 million, I gotta say, with sea level rise, it's only gonna grow. So if anybody's been, how many people have been to the waterfront of Seattle? Right. So right now you got the Ferris wheel, you got the ferry terminals, you got the port. Just picture sea level rise, and it's gonna rise. We just own more land. But now we're managing and owning all of the infrastructure that was built on that, was built not for aquatic purposes, but built for actual people living and working and enjoying the waterfront. Ocean acidification, I talked about shellfish. We are seeing ocean acidification at an unbelievable pace, and we are very concerned that it will wipe out not only the critical habitat that our marine survives on and depend on, but also, again, the economic opportunity that brings to many of the communities, our rural communities in Washington State. The sad part, or the challenging part of it, is we are at the forefront of ocean acidification research in the nation, and I have 3 people that do it. That's it. 3 people. We don't have the answers, we have some of the identification of potential solutions, but we aren't yet close to solving this problem at all. So this gets me to what I see as the greatest challenge in resiliency, which is we have communities in Washington State and frankly around this nation that their natural resource lands are what they depend on for their economy and their social benefit and value. So our natural industries make up in many of our rural communities more than 50% of their economy. In addition to that, they also provide in many of our counties over 40% of the operating budget for those counties. Their hospitals, their schools, their police and fire, their transportation network, even their energy network. They are on the front lines of not only the challenges that is going to come down with climate change on our natural resource industries, but also the impact it will have on their economies, which are very, very dependent on 1 and 2 industry bases that have already been challenged and significantly impacted. And this is where I think we need to be playing more of a focus. Right now, these are the places where for generations, if you think back to when Washington State was at its vibrant point, when my grandparents moved there in the Great Depression from South Dakota, these were the places people flocked to. And we're seeing generation after generation flee from these communities because they see no hope, they see no opportunity in these areas. And this is our job. So what I did just last month is I've been launched the Rural Communities Partnership Initiative because we have land in every single one of our communities that I believe we have to be on the ground in those communities actually helping work with them to identify strategies and solutions that grow those natural resource economies in a sustainable way, but also be able to diversify those economic bases, like in the area of clean energy. So I have 18 wind projects total in Washington State on my millions of acres of public lands. I have zero solar projects. Anyone who's in the solar industry, please come. We are open for business in Washington State. I have over 1 million acres of land that are open and available. And we just passed a solar incentive just last week in Washington State through our legislature. And here's the opportunity this creates. When I put solar or wind on my public lands, not only am I creating more energy independence for those communities and being able to reduce the cost and price of energy, but in addition to that, I move from generating about $1 an acre on grazing to $1,200 and $1,400 an acre. And all of that goes to the counties and the schools in these rural communities that are so dependent on very limited resources right now. This is where we can start to show in some of our more rural conservative communities that may have turned their back on these or not even looked at them at all, to be able to say, this is an economic opportunity for you and an independence opportunity. In addition to that, remember those forests, the 2.7 million acres of forests that are dying, and our ability now that we have to get on and start to actively manage those by selective thinning and cleaning out the dying and disease dead tree. We have a huge booming urban centers in our state that are actually needing to grow taller and higher to provide more housing and affordable housing and more commercial space. At the same time, we continue to use the outdated models of steel and concrete, which does not sequester carbon and leaves my trees to die on the forest floor where they become wildfire problem. We now have technology like cross-laminated timber and mass timber, which enables us to grow those buildings taller and higher, like in Canada, where we got an 18-story building built simply off of dead and diseased trees that are now the opportunity in the urban economy and where the rural communities are being part of that solution. Lastly, invest in recreation. We believe that there's a huge opportunity for many of these communities to actually really start to grow the recreation economy. I think Sun Valley is a perfect example of that. But let me tell you why I think this is even more important. Last year, as I ran around the state campaigning to be the Commissioner of Public Lands, everybody might remember that at least in the West and probably even farther across the nation is a battle on investment of public lands, being able to hold on to those public lands and the value. I truly believe that it's absolutely important for our government and state and local and federal government to be owning and managing public lands in the benefit of the commons, in the benefit of our communities and the public. Because if we are not thinking about that landscape and being able to ensure that we are designing and developing and caring for them, not just for today, but for the future, then we will lose them, and we will not be a community that's resilient. We'll be a community that has private sector interests and lots of ownership of land that may not have any value or limited value for those communities. The second part of this is that I truly believe, and I'm a mom of 3 boys, I raised them on a farm, they had to milk the goats at 6 a.m., they had to butcher the chickens and the pigs. And I will say to you, they're almost teens, one's already a teen. And last year while I was campaigning, I got a little distracted, as you can imagine, and my kids that grew up without TV, no video games, no phones, got lost in Pokemon. I came home one day after long campaigning, and all they did was this. They were walking, they were getting exercise, but this is what they were. And I had no idea what happened. I thought, gosh, I did everything right. I raised these kids on the land. I raised them to appreciate and love the land. And they've already been lost just within 6 months to technology. And the reality is my kids have had a much greater opportunity to actually get out on the landscape than many of the people in our communities and many of the children. And I truly believe that our #1 obligation is to make sure that we are connecting the next generation with our natural resource lands. Because the fact is, while we're making the decisions today, poorly or unpoorly, wisely or unwisely, they're making the decisions for tomorrow. And if they do not care, if they don't have a passion and commitment for these landscapes, then everything we have done will be for naught. So we have to do a job. If everybody thinks about when we had the national monuments, when we started actually committing to infrastructure on public landscapes, it was after the war when people were returning and they knew the way they were going to help their health, their mental health, their physical health, was to actually care and get out on the landscapes. We have an obligation to do the same thing, to make sure we have more public lands available in all the communities so people can get to them, but that we're also getting that next generation out there. Because if we don't, everything we do, all the time we're spending here today to create the new solutions and the new innovations, they'll be making the decisions and we will have lost them. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for all the work you do. I'm looking forward to learning from all of you so we can make some great things happen. And remember, Washington State is open for business, for great, innovative, sustainable technologies. Please come.